what is the aim of this colloquium? Our primary aim is that this will benefit the participating PhDs by giving them feedback on their research. And we also intend to engage with established areas of PhD, artistic or creative work PhD practice from other parts of the world. And for that reason, we're particularly appreciative of our foreign participants. That's Dr. Alex Ortega, who's here already, and Professor Marguerite Jarman, who I think must still join us. I don't think she's signed on quite yet, but we really do appreciate your involvement. Thank you very much. And also, of course, to thank our panelists, who are the other panelists from the School of Arts, all of them very busy, oversubscribed supervisors and teachers and researchers themselves who are participating, and especially to our three chairs. That is Brett Piper, Manola Gachari, and Sam Ravangai, who are not just participating in one panel, but will be chairing a further panel as well. We really do appreciate your input. And just briefly, I want to contextualize the institutional context that we're working in, and to remind you that this kind of work, to actually be doing creative work as part of a PhD at WITS, is only possible because in 2008, the then head of the school, Dr. Gerrit Olivier, put to the University Senate the proposal that we develop at WITS a number of different PhDs, creative work PhDs for each of the creative disciplines in the university. And very importantly, that proposal was initially rejected by the Senate. And the Senate, rather surprisingly, said they did not want to mess with the WITS PhD. There is one PhD at WITS. And they recognized the fact that creative work could be part of a PhD submission, but that it had to be evaluated and examined in the same way as any other PhD from WITS. And WITS, of course, priding itself on being one of the leading research universities in Africa. And what this meant is that a PhD was recognized, a PhD that could include a creative work portfolio as part of the submission, but that the primary evaluative criteria for that PhD would be that it represented a contribution to knowledge. The nature of that knowledge, the nature of that contribution was left unspecified. In fact, it was left for the faculties to specify how the creative work would represent a contribution to knowledge. And I know that certainly for one of our foreign guests, Alex, that is a somewhat questionable notion, the idea that creative work can produce knowledge. I hope that can feed into our discussions. But the result was that from 2009, we have here at WITS the possibility of passing a WITS PhD, earning a WITS PhD on the basis of creative work portfolio and a written component. And importantly, the standing order that was produced does not specify the relationship between the creative work and the written component, just that they have to be both. And it was framed as openly as possible and remained something that certainly we struggle with in the school, and of course relates to broader discussions and debates in the field of artistic research about the status of writing. So that we also need to consider going into these discussions. And let me lead us into our first panel discussion, which will be chaired by Professor Brett Piper, my colleague and head of the School of Arts. And Brett is also the principal investigator on the Arts Research Africa project, which I work on with Zanele. And Brett is himself a researcher whose work crosses a number of different disciplinary areas, notably musicology. He's also, in his previous life, before he took up his headship here at the school, he was the director of the Klein Karoo Kunstfees, the Little Karoo Arts Festival, where he played a major role in opening up that festival to much broader community involvement. So it's a great pleasure to hand over to Brett, who is going to chair this next panel and will be introducing the panelists. So Brett, over to you.
Thanks so much, Christo, and huge thanks to you and Zanele for all the work that's gone into bringing us together today. Really wonderful to also welcome you all from my side. So my pleasure is to introduce the first session today, and I'm going to begin by introducing the three distinguished panelists on the panel together with me. And first up, Christo has already indicated a welcome to our esteemed colleague, Alex Ortega. Hello, really great to see you. Alex has affiliations at Berlin University of the Arts and the Film University of Catalonia, as well as the Graduate School of the University of Lapland. He's an artist researcher himself who combines aesthetic, phenomenological, and activist research practices through an inquiry into embodiments, environments, and aesthetic cognition. He studied music theory, piano, electronic music, composition, and architecture in Barcelona and Berlin, and received a PhD in philosophy at the Humboldt University, also in Berlin. And currently, he's the principal investigator in the artistic research projects, two of them, one called Architecture of Embodiment, and the second, Contingent Agencies. Really looking forward to our engagements with you today, Alex. Secondly, I'm really delighted to introduce my colleague, Dr. Charlene Khan, who's an associate professor in the Department of Fine Arts in the Wits School of Arts. She's a South African visual artist and scholar whose work interrogates post-colonial and intersectional formations. She's a co-convener of the African Feminisms Conference, known as AFEMS, and runs the Art on Our Mind research project, the Black Feminist Killjoy Group, and the Decolonial Aesthesis Creative Lab. And the third panelist I'll be introducing is David Andrew, who's an associate professor and acting head of the Department of Fine Arts, also in our school. He studied at the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg and at Wits. Two of his most recent publications are Notes from Johannesburg, Dialogues and Itineraries of the South from Kinshasa, Art, History, and Education. And secondly, in Art Search, Punch and Judy, Pavements and Ponzi Schemes, in the volume on curating decolonial propositions, co-authored with Professor Jyoti Mistry, that also came out earlier this year. So I have it that it's exactly 9:15, and I'm grateful that Christo's already introduced me. So I think we can go to our first PhD creative researcher. And I'm delighted to introduce another colleague at Wits, Dr. Brigitte, soon to be Dr. Brigitte Stone Johnson. She's an interdisciplinary practitioner in architecture and the arts. And the focus of her work addresses themes of the post-human material in the Anthropocene. Her current work, which we can see on show in the Wits Art Museum at the moment, reads urban terrains through stone materials and agencies as a tool to unsettle anthropocentric narratives within post-extractive urban terrains. The title of her talk is Artistic Practice as a Tool for Unsettling Anthropocentric Narratives within the Urban Terrains of Johannesburg. I'm going to ask our speakers if they're able to time themselves so that I don't have to interrupt them, but I'll be timing, and after 15 minutes, I'll ask them to wind up. So Brigitte, if I could hand over to you, and if you're going to be screen sharing, you're welcome to do that now, whatever works for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Give me 1 second. Let me just switch to screen share. I've pre-recorded, so it should be within the time limits. There's just a little clip in the middle. I'm just going to jump through because it's a bit long. I hope that's okay.
Unsettled. Within my PhD, I considered the geological landscape and the human encounter with stony matter as a transcorporeal encounter with the human body as geology and stone as lively matter in the milieu of a lively and atmospheric world within creative practice. The work is situated within the context of Johannesburg. I do this as a means to trouble anthropocentric narratives of smooth surface, transience, and readings of the city as non-place. We live within an unsettled landscape, a landscape of vast geological significance, the watershed between the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, the sites of some of the world's most ancient rock, and deeply scarred by our human geowriting. The body of work emerges from a period of reflection on how stony material unsettles human-centered narratives in urban terrains. It emerges from a concern for thinking beyond the human as a response to the human matter binary present in the urban terrain. It emerges as a response of how we think and act towards materials within the city. When we think of stone, we often think of it as object or individual, as a surface for inscription, as an object or vessel to hold our ideas. In our framing, it is inert. It holds no agency of its own beyond its resistance to our actions. In the second, if we shift our thinking about stony matter to something which has agency, it is collective, it is social, it acts as a co-creator within a weathering and active world. Stone is, I suggest, a geosocial material. It is active and agentic within urban terrain. It is social. In other words, it wants to be with other matter, human and non-human alike. Within this work, I've chosen to use artistic matter as a tool for unsettling, primarily because it is indeterminate. It engages process, and it engages the body in the way that is able to work with materials. Practicing with. The critical aspect within the work is the practice of learning to act and orientate with stone, to work within the agencies of stone within the practice, to work rather than on a surface, to work with something which pushes back, to work with something which flows, which agglomerates, which exists within a weathering landscape. Within this practice, I imagine stone to be a co-laborer rather than an active agent in the creation and formation of the work, rather than something which I am working with. Within the practices, I look at the following elements which I've called unsettled practices. Practices of fragmenting, practices of weathering, practices of aggregating, practices of gathering. I began the work with fragmenting photographs taken over a period of reflective walking within the terrain. Photographing the weathered surface really centers the image within the work, and in my first iteration, I was really trying to explore this kind of notion of what I was seeing in the landscape, this idea of fracturing the surface, a surface which is crumbling, yet at the same time not crumbling, a surface which is composed of kind of human-made materials and geological materials that is weathering over time, but at the same time it is forming itself anew. The works were then assembled onto white paper and collaged as they saw fit. The next few slides illustrate.
Sorry. Sorry, let me just talk. The second iteration talks to the idea of weathering. I use cyanotype, which is a material which exists within quite a weathered context. And I work over that with various weathering mediums, iron, copper, other sorts of things found in the landscape, ochres, and so on.
The next few slides illustrates the weather work. For me, the process became almost more important in the weathering than the actual final outcome, as through the process is really where we kind of rub up against the materials, where the traces of the materials are left on the paper, but also that they are left on us, on our bodies, on our clothes, on the surfaces within my home where I was working. And we see within the process works also get a much stronger sense of the kind of weather around the process. Clouds, shadows, rain, light, darkness, the reflections of the things that are happening around the projects. So for me, really, it is the sense of time within the weather work, which is so important, which I was really trying to explore within the process. The amount of time it takes for the rust to degrade enough that it adheres to the paper, the amount of time it takes to patina the copper so that you can get it off the plate. And this process is really about a slow encounter with a quite molecular level of stony materials.
And then these are the finished works. You can see some of them have been toned and then worked over with iron and copper is the blue. Others have been worked directly on the cyanotype. The goal has been really to explore how both the chemicals behave with one another, as well as how they behave over the image, and to weather the surface, to disrupt the surface, to almost rub off the chemical onto the surface of works. Within the works, the idea of plastic has become quite a strong feature, and it kind of comes up again and again, primarily because it is one of the materials which you find most commonly within these terrains. You find tar, concrete, normal kind of geological matter from the landscape, and then plastic enmeshed within that concoction.
Learning to agglomerate with stone rather than to assemble stone. The gathering and growing considers a practice of working in stony ways between fragmentary decay and vital becoming through the creation of site-specific rubble and refuse sculptures, using tar, concrete, brick, plastic, and organic matters, as well as found stones within the landscape. The work begins with a series of spontaneous assemblages and then moves on to collected objects and then finally onto the larger sculptural works you'll see in a moment.
First few works began as spontaneous gatherings of objects found. These are in my driveway in Brixton, kind of assembled from things that were lying around after refuse day, and also the kind of materials that are just available in the kind of urban landscape. And then the smaller sort of agglomerations are generally were made from collected objects found in my studio. Most of these were created over COVID when I didn't have access to the larger materials. So I began to play with the idea of gathering small things. How do they collect? How do they move with one another? So generally, you'll see within all of the agglomerations that I bring in an element of living things, roots. In this example, a piece of
plant that I pulled out while I was gathering tar. And I think the organic is kind of essential within these kind of enmeshments in order to bring the kind of idea of the collective together.
Currently, the work is in an iteration at WAM, exploring the notions of gathering and growing with collective works.
Sorry, this is not stuck. Okay, you've seen most of it. I'm not sure what's going on there. Hi.
Thanks so much, Brigitte. Are you ready to wrap up?
Sorry?
Have you formally completed your presentation?
Yes, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. That's exactly 15 minutes. So we have a couple of minutes to just take initial responses. I'm going to give the panelists routinely a chance for a first response. If there are any quick questions of clarification or comment, obviously, as Zanele said, we'll pick up a more substantive discussion in the final session this afternoon from 3:15. Alex, Charlene, David, any initial comments? We're going to start the next session in 2 minutes at 9:35, and I'm going to ask Megan to be on standby for that, please. But please just raise your hands or indicate if you'd like to speak. And please, colleagues who are not panelists, if you can add your comments to the chat. Alex, please come in.
Hi, thank you all for allowing me to be here, and thank you so much, Brigitte, for your fantastic presentation, your fantastic work. Maybe just because we just have 2 minutes, 2 points to talk about it later. One is the specificity of the agencies of the stone. Yeah, so in this movement of acknowledging agencies to non-human and even not living beings, yeah, I think it is important to not anthropomorphize them and then to recognize the specificity of agencies. So stones maybe don't want anything, maybe wanting is something that humans do, but not stones. This is one point. And the other point about the setting and this fantastic catalog of practices you presented. Do you think them as a way of being able to access these agencies? Yeah. So are somehow these practices forms of agencies notation? Thank you.
I think so. I think one of the things which drew me to the arts practice for this project in the first place is the way that as beings that are moving through landscapes, for me, that's an incredibly powerful way of being able to think in ways that are actually having a body which is in an atmosphere that walks, that moves, that touches, that feels surfaces, that is engaging in a very atmospheric way. That it's, for me, the practices and the fact that I'm able to work directly with the materials, for me, is a kind of, I guess it's phenomenological, right? Kind of way of learning to engage with agencies which are actually quite complicated and are taking place over incredibly long periods of time. So for me, the kind of practices are a kind of way of allowing us to get into the kind of time frame of the material, to get into the kind of time frame of being slow within landscape, and to kind of be in a quite embodied way with the stones, rather than kind of thinking about them in purely, I'm an architect by training, so with the way we think about materials is very technical and it's very science-based. And for me, the practice have really allowed me to kind of move from the science position to a much more fluid way of thinking about how they're kind of acting in landscapes.
Thank you so much for that exchange. So I have to already declare the dilemma of the timekeeper today. As I understand it, Zanele and Christo, we do need to go to the next speaker now, but can we hold these generative questions and observations? I see Charlene's hand is up. Can I ask Charlene to maybe hold that question and see if we can still voice it towards the end of this session? But I do need to let the next speaker go now. Is that correct, Christo? Is that knowing that we're also sort of setting the time pattern for the day now? Okay. Yes. So Charlene, thanks for indicating. If you can please just hold but note your question. I'm next going to introduce Megan Judge. So just to clarify, our second listed speaker, Janet Solomon, is with us, but due to technical reasons, we've moved her presentation to after Megan and Roelof Petrus van Wyk. So she'll make the last presentation in this session. So that brings us to our next speaker, who is Megan Judge. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Megan as a PhD fellow in the Wits School of Arts, as well as as WISER, the Wits Institute of Social and Economic Research, where she's part of the project Oceanic Humanities for the Global South. The work inquires and experiments, moving through curation, sonic, and visual arts. Currently, she's developing a creative practice that diffracts ocean through terror vis-a-vis the noising edges of signal and static. And we look forward to her taking us through that now. The title of her presentation is Uncontainable Containers, Compositions That Together Apart. Thanks, Megan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just going to share my screen here and get straight into it. I hope, let me know if there are any issues with this screen that's being shared at the moment.
It's loading at the moment and we're seeing it now. Thanks so much.
Great. So this paper focuses on the building of a practice that exists in a state of return. What is being returned to are the rearranging elements I experienced whilst traversing parts of the Indian Ocean during tropical cyclone season while working as crew on a small yacht. What drove me to go was the desire to get to Madagascar so I could look into some social histories that later informed my MA dissertation. I thought that the ocean trip would allow for a certain quality of slowness to come in and shape the research that I was just beginning with no real direction yet. I hoped that the voyage would open somehow the ways in which knowledge used to move across the Indian Ocean waters during and before its flourishing trade system, which built rich shared networks, communities, and economies, what I didn't factor in was just how much the ocean itself, through its active weathering, rearranging Earth systems, would change my surface, open my pores, and infiltrate into my psyche. This has been the biggest affect on my creative work, and I'm continually finding ways of returning to how I was weathered during the voyage. Now that I am on Terra again, I try to understand why it is that I'm not firmly on it, why I still carry the ocean waters pulled inside of me, and how I can understand this rearranged me in relational perspective with the ocean. When I look at works I've made since this voyage, I don't see separated individual artworks. I see a mounding of iterative returns, each time measured differently because each time is filled with differences, eddying around the same phenomenon. I realize now that I can't make objective works with the ocean or about the ocean which reflect on this time. I'm always entangled within it, just as the ocean now pools in me. I can only make work in relation with the ocean. Interestingly, when thinking about this relationing, I engage in an act of measuring myself apart from it. And so I become completely entangled and a part. While out at sea, I held onto terra comforts, up until they cracked away from me with the final reaches of long-range special weather broadcast signal from the delightful Peri Peri radio station based in Durban. We had been tuning into the station every evening to catch the weather bulletin and touch base with the operator affectionately known as Roy. This radio station sent out signals that overflowed from the weather broadcast. It hosted us in terror-based knowledge, and for a while we were parted from the wild weather we sailed in. This closer proximity to terror brought a sense of a surety that things were predictable, determined. In the broadcasts, we also received signal from those other scattered and few sailors who were out there somewhere in the waters. At the correct time every day, we huddled around the receiver apparatus like families do for their favorite evening soap opera drama, feeling into the lives of others as they tried to linger a while longer with us when it was their turn to speak. The centrifugal force in it all was our host, Roy. As he hosted us, we hosted terror via him, with those all too familiar and now pleasant interruptions of a ringing phone, his wife needed collecting from the mall, or a very important sports match which meant that the broadcast would end early that day. A sense of terror security bound up in comforts seeped through his very formal marine NATO speak and warmed the airwaves. And when that crackled away into static, it felt like void on the other side of terror. Now it was just us and the ocean, just us and the ocean. We began to fully face it. It is this very static that I keep returning to, the moments in between terror and ocean where I began to open the pores at my surface, drinking in the patterns that acted all around. Static is diffraction. It consists of multiple waves coming together and produces patterns of more. It contains sonic properties referred to as spherics, which, like dust, are made up of pretty much everything. The proximity of our presence also sounds in that static, as does the machine that receives it. Static reconfigures temporality, spatiality, and possibility. It contains relations in sound. In my practice, I return to the static and the temporality of drift that we entered into after we slipped into static. Drifting, our vessel was moved along by the waters and winds through cyclonic activity, storms and eyes, as we began to sense the oceanic activity more thickly. It is here that I became rearranged in relation. Through my work, I'm always becoming in relation to this temporality that loops and curls in topological patterns of the weather's making. My creative inquiry is always bound up ontologically in this temporality, as I make sense of how rearranged by it I've become. I now search for and trace noisy edges, and by doing this, I attempt to sense into the more that noise offers. Noise brings into question my own perceptibility. It indicates where I draw my binary lines, those surfaces that are now being weathered into. In this sense, my practice is a world in one. It works or worlds towards more porous worlds. And this worlding practice sediments further through the heightened tensions I've been in of late as a mother researcher in pandemic. Recently, time itself has become increasingly noisy as I was pushed to its edges. Like many others in this time, I have a story. I had just handed in my PhD proposal and began my research, but I could not access the ocean where my research was based. Locked in at home meant being in a state of overload with information about anxiety, about this mutating virus on the internet, my PhD, reading, writing, thinking, and making, breastfeeding and all that comes with it, notably how it determines time slots and routining, familying, and a large amount of caring work. All of this jostled up against each other for room in an overcrowded time of isolation. Eventually, I reached saturation point. It was then that I blanked out the information and released what I've come to call worlds, these looping images I've been showing you on the screen. These worlds provide room for me to breathe. They hold data and theory in distilled ways, embedded in creative pullings together through thickening and affecting loops. Although these worlds are without sound, they are not silent. In them, the lonesome sailor can be sensed broadcasting back to terror from outside the edge of it in a weather and weathering report. Finding practice in relation with environmental encounters, worlds a justice to come, via the dissonance that such a practice creates for the individualistic and overdetermined human-centered world that they navigate away from. Following the initial release of these artworks, I became involved in an experimental collective which played with the traditional hierarchies of theater making by placing the digital artist as lead. Together, we expanded these worlds into the Lonely Sailor Weather Report, also a broadcast series. The worlds now became inhabited by an exquisite puppet, which is human enough to believe and blank enough to project onto. The way in which I opened up these worlds for the next iteration is important to my position as mother researcher animator in pandemic. There is much to be said for the importance of its experimentation in unsustainable times. As a mother, this meant bringing experimentation into the way I animate, so that I can not only survive in it, but maybe just attempt to thrive as an animator. There is also much to be said about the soft violences of the animation industry, and as a mother with a young child, I would simply be pushed out. So I used my worlds to open deeper into a worlding practice which, at the same time, protected me from the crazy imaginations of people who think animations can achieve anything in zero amount of time. Now the worlds were made, the scenography set the stage, and the 2 weeks we had to make these experiments could be faced with a little more playful grace. Our dynamic group all shifted out of their usual roles and offered multiple bits and pieces into our collective carrier bag. I opened this bag to allow the bits to encounter one another on screen, looking for a certain affective excess that they produced and shaping the broadcasts around that. While the weight of the work still lay heavily on my shoulders, it was a generative weight, one where a growing back could happen. It pressed me into the pools of water I carry in my psyche, and here I let the temporality of drift guide the work, noising the practice of animation, which is so usually bound up in a temporality of progress. Drifting it into aimless static, which is moved along by currents of return. Staying with this for a while is what I hope these 7 looping, thickening broadcasts achieve, of which I'll just show 3 if time allows.
Via PhD on using FM, Mandagi, here on Netting FM. Hope you're ready for things here on 98.5 Netting FM. Coming up soon is your exciting and magnificent one. And what's the lights? The thing is, what's going to happen? So we'll see that later when you come back and we'll be excited. Remember, this is of course. No. Bana ba itabogela batsadi ba bone ba ba atla ka lorato banna bagolo ba thula ba tlotla dinale ba kgarebe a opela dipina tse di etswa makao a goeletsa makwalo a lorato mme bommagwe bana ba ba tlhoba marama ka matsogo a bone a the rain in the bowl, as usual, and a dash of lamp sprinkled fog. I stir. My spirit raises in a northeasterly direction towards my mouth, which is good occasionally. I eat. As I eat, I feel my thoughts becoming cyclonic. 5, then becoming west 5 or 6. I'm feeling my head on the shadows. My head is sounding like sounds out into the sea, into the silence.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. Really wonderful to see that material and to hear it. Colleagues, I'm going to suggest, because I noted that David also had a comment from the previous one, but rather than open and then truncate a very short discussion after the presentations, I suggest we continue with the expository part of the session, and we're well on track to be able to discuss all the presentations before we wrap the session. So at that point, and Zanele, if I could just ask that you please readmit David to the session, who we seem to have lost momentarily. I'm going to next introduce Roelof Petrus van Wyk. So Roelof is also, of course, a Wits School of Arts PhD candidate. He's an artist, architect, archives and visual culture researcher. And his 2021 PhD is titled Picturing. He works across various disciplines with a focus on affective archives and sensuous urban placemaking in public buildings and public spaces through arts initiatives, art installations, and specific arts-based research projects. The title of his talk is Atlas of Shame, Desire, Disgust, and Difference. Roelof, I'm delighted to hand over to you.
Thank you, Brett. Let me just get this share screen thing right. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. The title of my research is called Picturing, and it is both a noun and a verb because it is about pictures, but it's also about how pictures affect the viewer. My talk is broken up into three parts: the problematic, the archives that I investigate, and then a reflection on that. So I'm just giving you a bit of an overview on it. The first part, we will talk about the problematic. The second part are the three archives, all of them apartheid archives, one more regime governmental, the second visual, and the third popular mass media. And in the third part, I reflect on that work and also set myself up for towards new knowledge and towards some kind of hypothesis, which I will then apply in my practice. So the problematic is a constellation of questions, of which the methodological is my primary question. What is the destabilizing and critical potential of a queer autoethnography interrogating a set of apartheid archives? And how could that performative interrogation give form to the development of an arts-based research set of methods and methodologies? The second anchor of the problematic is the Wits PhD creative work standing orders, which, as you know, requires the submission of a creative work plus a written text which contextualizes the work critically. And to a point that Christo made earlier, in this dissertation, I experiment with a singular hybrid submission in a reflective doubling, which I call the Atlas of Shame, Desire, Disgust, and Difference. And it contains the documentation of the arts-based research, of the methods and methodologies, the artworks, as well as the reflections through the artworks, through the writing, and then as a physical submission. It's a box collection of 5 archival artists' books. It's a physical artifact. The final driver of the problematic asks, how do you queer an archive? And specifically an apartheid archive. Queer interventions can demonstrate the importance of refiguring notions of loss and require rethinking of how apartheid's archival ordering system shaped the legibility of the queer figure. These queer figures ask me to consider who is left out of the apartheid archive, why, and what this tells us about the epistemology of the apartheid archive. And the silences in the apartheid archive, like clearings, they show us how historical and archival violence are embedded within the official history-making projects. The first of the 3 archives which intersect and which I interrogate is a 400-page recording of parliamentary presentations on the homosexual problem in 1966 in South Africa. The Minister of Justice, straight white men from all the churches, straight white men from all the white universities, straight white male psychologists, straight white male psychiatrists, lawyers, teachers, social workers, they all delivered expert witness on the homosexual problem. There was a single lawyer, Arthur Chaskelson, to the South Africans. We know who he is. He represented what they call the affected parties, the homosexuals. In this chamber, in May 1969, the South African Parliament ratified the Immorality Amendment Act number 57 of 1969, an amendment to the immorality law. And yes, it's the very same one that controlled and criminalized relationships between, in apartheid speak, Europeans and non-Europeans in its original iteration. So why would these straight white men devote such attention to gay white men? This is where queer and Black lives intersect in the official apartheid archive. And James Baldwin posits that the sexual question and the racial question has always been entwined. So we already know that in a society that features straight, white, cisgendered men at the top of humanity's hierarchy, every being who is not that gets assigned a lower order of being. But within that, anything or anyone that reduces the percentage of SWMs, feminizes them, or who is not contributing to creating more of them, they are seen as weakening the race. I'm building into an argument. In the presentations leading up to the ratified amendment, the gay law, the queer figure was always homosexual, always male, always white, always medically pathologized, always criminally identified, especially and specifically in relation to pedophilia and a danger to the morals of white nationalist Christian society. But we have to go below that. And my question is, what is the effective engine? What is the emotion of the not so invisible apparatus that underpins this system of white supremacist patriarchy? The Immorality Amendment was also called, it's funny a little bit, the 3 men at a party law. 2 men to fulfill the undefined homosexual deed, and a third to testify in court in the witness stand. Now, this construct stands in for Bentham's panoptic model, working towards what we think the gay is for the gay population to self-regulate their behavior. But it is actually more important, and this is an insight from my research, is that for the paranoid straight white male population to not be demoted in the apartheid hierarchical society, he has to police his own behavior. Yes, to publicly display his racism, but also not to be called a faggot. He has to overperform his masculinity, and yes, racial and misogynistic violence on display, but also contact sport, supporting and partaking in the military, as conscription was just implemented in the same year that the presentation started after Verwoerd's assassination. And most importantly for my research, what Judith Butler calls his straight imperative to reproduce more white people and to be shamed by the apartheid regime into doing that. Now, to contextualize that point is the census figures of 1967 made it very clear that the white minority who was in control was also shrinking at a massive margin as Black African population were urbanizing. However, at this point, and I quote Mark Gevisser here in Defiant Desire, he states that the national control over South Africa was consolidated through the construction of bogeymen and Black conspiracies, communist conspiracies, the English conspiracies, and the Jewish conspiracies have now one more bogeyman, the queer conspiracy. So I use the apartheid regime's own method of visually censoring documents against their own material. I took the 400 pages and I redacted those pages up into a kind of bureaucratic and banal poetry or an illumination by erasure, making visible that which has been invisible or erased for such a long time. Here are some examples of that. But gay men now became a receptacle for white South Africa's endemic swart gevaar, Black danger, anxiety, and the parliamentary presentations were all just driving towards implementing the gay law. But what they did is they made the homosexual visible. For the first time, our lives, or what was pictured as a chosen lifestyle, were visually, socially, morally codified, pathologized, and criminalized. And we started to appear as homosexuals in popular mass culture. We became seen like Scope magazine. Here you're looking at Colin Anstey, proud, self-confessed homosexual, I'm quoting, who was also protesting outside Parliament in 1968 against the gay law. The first time that white queer men actually came out of their white privilege and protested the system of the regime. In this exhibition of mine, as part of the PhD research, I became Colin. I also performed the role of the Minister of Justice. I performed the archive in an installation together with drawings, which was tracing of the gay law, and photographs, which I'm going to show you some just now, in a way to inhabit an archive and to excavate its emotional underpinnings in a very charged, intimate, and exposed condition. This is my first set of arts-based methods that I now start to sum up: drawing, redaction, performance. And I will stack these to the end of my my talk. The second archive is a photographic archive. I've been photographing for 2 decades, banal South African monuments and banal landscapes, but now infecting these images with my autoethnographic memory, with parliamentary records and trashy magazine images, they are transformed into more than just photos. They become views which opens up dialectical interpretation, transcending their photographic conventions through place, through time, traveling outside of their frame subject. Some autoethnographic narrative. On 11th of March, 1969, I was born into a white Afrikaner, Christian, nationalist identifying family. I was also born a shame. I was born a sin. I was born a criminal, and I was born homosexual. I grew up in a small farming town in the Transvaal, Afrikaner Boer heartland called Kinross. It is not picturesque. On 24 September 2018, I took a drive on Heritage Day to photograph this street you are looking at now, which was named after the architect of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd. And I've been photographing all the streets in South Africa still named after him, which makes for a banal yet fascinating visual archive. For example, discovering that the local ANC office in Nigel is located in Verwoerd Street. But I grew up in this street. I fell down in this street. I was assaulted in this street. I delivered daily newspapers and magazines down this street. A visitor to my first research exhibition, where I staged the archives of Scope magazine as a mapping, asked me about this image during a walkabout. He said, "What does it look like today?" I told him, "This is today." It is a dialectical image. It becomes that, an image between the past and the present, and an image through which lines of logic, arguments, and unreasonable doubt can reach. It's like the scene of a crime. Walter Benjamin states in relation to Eugene Atget's Empty Streetscapes of Paris, he says, "A crime scene too is deserted. It's photographed for the purpose of establishing evidence, and is it not the task of the photographer to uncover guilt and name the guilty in his pictures?" It is in this image that the first flickering, not of Benjamin's guilt, but of shame, that starts to emerge in my photo archive. In simple terms, guilt is the responsibility for something you've done, voting for the National Party during apartheid, but shame is what you feel for being who you are. I want you to imagine a picture playing out behind the facade of the house on the corner, where a 5-year-old boy's maternal uncle would regularly in public violently expose the young boy's naked body to the world. This is a poem I wrote about that. I'm not going to perform it now. It's a little bit of short on time, but I'm happy to do it a little bit later if anybody wants a one-on-one little performance. Part 2, this is the summary. Photography.
Thanks, Roloff. If I could ask you to wrap up, please.
I will do. Performance and poetry is the second set of ABR methods and methodologies here. The third and final set was the Scope archives themselves. I spent months, years scanning, photocopying, and then transforming the content of that magazine into an atlas. Within that magazine, I'm just showing you two examples of two cover models. The one, a typical model, a stereotypical cover model. The one on the right, a transgender female model in 1985. And it's a space between these two images that opens up a criticality for me, wherein I can start to create my practice and to develop my practice and develop other arts methods and methodologies. Finally, these are the three final set of arts methods: ephemeral, intuition, epiphany, and synchronicity. Since I'm running out of time, shame, picturing, and the atlas. These are my theoretical structures, my theoretical frameworks, and this in the end is the new knowledge that I will contribute to my field. I'll show you 4 more images of the content of the atlas so that you have a bigger picture. Typical layout, typical content sets developed through it. It is a 900-page, 5-book document. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Roelof. Really compelling work, and just extraordinary to see one after the other how rich the materials are we have to reflect on. So at this point, I'm going to introduce our final presenter for this session, following which we'll be able to take more feedback from the panelists and also hopefully to start engaging with questions in the chat. So I'm very pleased to introduce Janet Solomon, who's an award-winning artist filmmaker. Her recent creation, Becoming Visible, is a disquieting fusion of documentary and video art, focusing on an offshore oil and gas seismic survey off the South African coast that was extended into the whale migration season. Solomon is co-founder of the Oceans Not Oil Coalition, and its campaign is involved in opposing offshore oil and gas exploration applications, climate futures, engaging policymakers and government agencies. Her talk is entitled Agitating Against Gas, Documentary Impulse as More Than Dissent. Janet, we're really happy to have you with us. I hope that the technical issues are behind us. Are you ready to proceed?
Let's hope, Brett. I think what I will do is I am going to go through the chapter that I'm busy working on now, and then we can have a look at the film, just because of time issues. I think that's probably going to be the best. And I don't want to be fighting glitches potentially. Right, brilliant. Let's head on. I've called this Agitating Against Gas, Documentary Impulse as More Than Dissent. This presentation takes as its starting point the scientific consensus in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report, warning that continued oil and gas exploration and production exacerbates effects to ocean warming, its consequential sea level rise, acidification, and ocean loss, already disrupting global weather, marine ecosystems, and impacting ocean and terrestrial biodiversity. Meanwhile, the offshore oil and gas stream of South African government's economic development imaginary, Operation Pekisa, has escalated its drive for extraction and exploration, pushing for 30 new offshore oil wells by 2030. A gas master plan is also developing for an expanded national natural gas infrastructure involving 3,500 kilometers of gas pipeline networks along South African coastlines, port facilities, and liquefied natural gas power plants, all of which will take years to build and even longer to break even, and will cost South African taxpayers millions. Operation Pekisa's vision for a fast-tracked South African gas future establishes its oil and gas stream as an imaginary. The future orientation of Pekisa mapped out upon the ocean carves up almost all of it for oil and gas license blocks. How the Pekisa offshore oil and gas imaginary intersects with human and more than human lives and their tolerance, or how it engenders resistance or not, is key to understanding how to produce a counter-imaginary to a gas-based economic development model articulated and engineered to maintain all the growing imbalances of a capitalist ocean extractivist one. The Agulhas is revered by local people in diverse forms, in historic, cultural, scientific, aesthetic, spiritual, and intimate bonds, with its value held by past, present, and for future generations. It is from within these communities that ordinary people have been stepping forward to express concerns surrounding and opposition to offshore oil and gas extraction. Public participation processes for two particular applications have been contentious. Participants described experiencing a core disconnect as so many crucial perspectives were overlooked between environmental impact assessment paid for and pre-shaped by the developer and due diligence mandated to consider the precautionary principle. What so many of the stakeholders were attempting was meaningful reassociation of the marine environment to paradigms of relation and care. The Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, who heads up Operation Pikisa, dismissed this battery of concerns and objections from over 100 stakeholders and 47 appellants to application 236ER to prioritize extending the minerals energy complex into the ocean commons and authorized it in December 2020. Considering carbon emission-induced climate changes and collapse of ecologies in the ocean, there's an urgency to profoundly rethink imaginaries of the sea as resource and commons. It is this yoke of development imaginary controlled process that needs disruption. Stakeholder contentions about how rational offshore Pikisa is regards climate future, energy return on energy invested, drilling in ultra deep water, government capacity regards environmental compliance and mitigation, food security and inclusiveness, makes this an urgent public issue. Leveraging what documentary film critic and activist Thomas Waugh calls use value of documentary impulse as an experimental provocation, the aim is to speak to and through resisting the monoculture of the Pikisa petro-imaginary. By claiming a position as filmmaker outside of its hegemony, which has minimized the meaning of so many others and refused to articulate energy alternatives, my research can interrogate the validity of its premises and promises. Environmental philosopher and eco-feminist Val Plumwood's concept of economic rationalism and master relations will be used as an analytical lens. This month, South African climate scientist and contributor to the latest IPCC report, Professor Francois Engelbrecht, highlighted how important to focus on communication of the climate science is, but posed the question of whether awareness will lead to global behavioral and policy change. He throws doubt on whether the hypnotic hold of the global petro-imaginary can be broken by climate science or by the logic of lived boiling frog experience, which should verify it. Knowing that there is a high probability of a 1 meter sea level rise by 2050 and a likelihood of a 12-meter rise in the next century is not enough. Video advocacy scholar Julia Kane sums it up. While raising awareness is a prerequisite for catalyzing change, this does not, in and of itself, necessarily affect change. This poses a huge challenge to how research functions and intervenes in the political process to halt the expansion of hydrocarbon development, how it might engage climate-related mobilization, and what role anticipatory creative practice aimed at making the climate future knowable might play. Does documentary filmmaking offer any useful promise in affecting change? Producer-director Jill Godmillow, director of Far From Poland, questions the long theorized idea that the documentary object takes its material force as social change rooted in the politics of expose, which introduces to vision otherwise practices or spaces that we should know about but don't, either because we don't want to or because we aren't meant to. Instead, she suggests that those documentaries that stand a chance in the glut being produced ad infinitum to engage audiences beyond the viewing moment are not trying to hide behind the pedigree of the real. She proposes a strategy for rethinking documentary filmmaking as critique or poetry that self-consciously uses photographic material from the archive of the real. Godmillo calls the historical relationship between the audience and a documentary a false transaction, one in which the subject is tamed by the process of enlightenment. This enlightenment claims a pedigree of truth, dumbed down to serve a sense of ourselves, underpinned by imperialism and its younger sister colonialism and its baby sister underdevelopment. She advocates instead for a self-conscious treatment of cinematic and semantic elements, which constructs a relationship between the audience and the filmmaker's knowledge, instead of a false relationship between the audience and the people in the film. To create a documentary which demands a more socially aware form of resolution, Godmillo suggests disrupting the gaze of the audience, its intentions of wholeness, and how it has been taught to gaze. The Pakisa gaze, as an offshore extractivist vision, sees the ocean as largely unknown, or an abyss where toxic drill wastes can be discarded. This normalizes risk to an already vulnerable sea and those who live in it, and assumes an inevitability to how the petro-imaginary will change what the sea is composed of. Stakeholder concerns contest this gaze, evoking a different gaze, one that sees the ocean as an inhabited and meaningful place, based on a relational rather than a colonial understanding of maritime space. The sea will be invited in as a character, a point of view, to interrogate the footage, its received meanings, and level the relational playing field. This documentary project is intended to experiment with a decolonial ecofeminist documentary praxis, to not only critique the rationalism of offshore Pakisa, but in the process explore the genre's potential for political agency. This drive to understand how the codes of documentary address function as provocation and intervention obviously tracks the medium from its beginnings, and there are lessons from the pioneers. For instance, documentary film and newsreel director Dziga Vertov theorized that documentary's potential as a tool for social change lay in its form, and that the battle to influence hearts and minds might be taken directly to the most marginalized people. It is how and that Vertov's films function as communist agitprop, despite his refusal of coherent, character-driven narratives, that interests me. The capacity for disruption formed by his documentary's surrealist moments, the montages, their irony, their overt construction. In short, the ways in which the term documentary can be problematic. American film critic and theoretician Bill Nichols calls attention to the subversive operations in Dutch documentary filmmaker Joris Ivan's experimentation, practice of appropriation of others' footage, compilation, and collage. The complex intermeshing of subjective and objective is the pushing of boundaries in the documentary code. The engaged partisanship of Barbara Koppel's Harlan County, USA, her disorientating framing, adroit editing collisions and juxtapositions behave as Brechtian, reflexive elements that smudge the glass on realism and are now recognized as major aspects of certain modes of documentary filmmaking. It is this rub between interventionist documentary strategy to shift the balance of visibility and how it disturbs the view that bears exploring. Might the formidable representational obstacles that hinder efforts to mobilize change be those that disrupt presupposed outcomes or functional ends? Resisting the false polarization of the political and the poetic, Godmillo writes, something that satisfies as film experience in terms of length, interest, rhythm, moral dilemma, characterization of good and bad, etc., can't dream. It can't provoke imagination. For decolonialism theorist Walter Mignolo, any delinking from the geopolitical configuration of the world requires disobedient enunciation by introducing a disruption and a crack into the calm waters of reality to refuse the presupposition of universal naming. Film scholar and media maker Angela Aguayo reminds us that documentary functions in a broad framework of impact, that it is not simply audience-based. This is reaffirmed by filmmaker George Stoney's statement that pre-interview documents, interview processes, and post-screening discussions are as important or more so than the film itself because of the biases that are questioned and identifications solidified. Aguayo believes that the documentary impulse generates social change when its struggle makes contact with power, and that documentary slides between the dimensions of culture, policy, law, structure, and institution, mediating conflict and power. By engaging with government stakeholders and oil corporation applicants, my documentary intervenes to ensure that ocean health, climate change, and a transformative just transition are placed in relation to and penetrate the exclusionary grids of understanding of offshore assessments and decisions. Aguayo claims the knowledge production of documentary production has the benefits of allowing communities visible points of public articulation, protest, and access to the public historical record that forces a kind of accountability. Decolonial thinkers and artists call for a delinking from projects of Western progress, where being and language have been inscribed through the structures of coloniality. This scholarship, placed in dialogue with various stakeholder imaginaries, could articulate responsiveness to unique ecologies and relations of human, oceans, and those in the ocean. A decolonial lens allowing a fisheye perspective pulls epistemological possibilities for different futures from the homogenizing space of stakeholder comment into the dialectical. Another ripple generated through the process of filming is one which could go some way to building a resistant counter-imaginary. Is the sharing that binds the stakeholders through their and their supporters' refusal of consent in a common battle against injustice. Aguayo argues that the construction of collective identification that documentary praxis facilitates through building self-realization and purpose in others further expands the possibility for political agency. Ecofeminists would add that patterns of difference and sameness need attending to in order not to reproduce inequalities or downplay any conflicts and contradictions experienced by the participants. Aguayo claims that the documentary impulse realizes its potential to support social transformations by centering conflicts for resolution.
Janet, if I could ask you to wrap up, please.
Sure. If my praxis consists in political use value, it is not only to offer up a documentary that, like the myth of Icarus, functions as a cautionary tale, but also that, in the words of Nichols, brings us to the precipice beyond which we can glimpse a future we have yet to attain and a past we must remember but leave behind. So that is the chapter. I've obviously, I don't know how much of the movie we can play.
Can you just give us like less than a minute just to get a sense of the material? Obviously, we'd love to see more on another occasion.
Sure. Could Brigitte or
I've got a cue.
right.
So literally just to give us a sense of the material. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
I believe in African religion and the sea and all other natural resources. It relates to our spirit. We believe, and I believe firmly, that if I go to the sea, it's one way of communicating with my ancestors who passed on.
the sea holds very deep spiritual meaning for me, relating to both of my cultures. I'm part of the Xhosa culture, and I'm also part of the Bushman or Sand culture. For both those cultures, there's connections to the ocean.
Thanks, Brigitte. I hate to do this, but really great to see. And thanks, Janet. Maybe later we can also just indicate what the timelines are to be able to see the work entirely. So, colleagues, I just want to thank the 4 presenters thus far for the extraordinary convergences and counterpoints between these 4 projects. And so I'd love to go back to Charlene, who initially wanted to respond to Brigitte's presentation. By now, Charlene, I'd like to offer you an opportunity to pick that up, but you may like also to speak to the other 3. We'll go to David then, and back to Alex. We do need to wrap up this session in 15 minutes at 10:45. So let's try to divide the time between us kind of 5 minutes each. Back to you, please, Charlene.
So yeah, I mean, I do think some of the students are students from our department, so they do hear quite a lot from us. But I think it's, for Brigitte, I did want to sort of ask the kind of question around, Brigitte speaks about Johannesburg as a non-place, and I was wondering what that term meant, Johannesburg is a non-place. I thought, in all 3 sort of presentations, Janet's, Brigitte's, and Megan, the idea of sort of feminist ecologies comes through in various ways. And of course, even in Roelof's, the ideas around feminization. But in different ways, I think this idea of feminist weathering is quite interesting, and how that can be further theorized in all of their different ways. In Brigitte's, this idea of speculation that is picked up as usually a sort of masculine frontier activity that can further be extended as a kind of a questioning activity, as a refutation and refusal as sort of a feminist willfulness that Sarah Ahmed posits, and how that can be further theorized in terms of speculation around stony materiality, and the ways in which she sort of listens to that materiality. And then in terms of sort of weathering, in terms of outlasting, enduring, and feminist listening and listening to generational wisdoms and gleaning that information of what came before. So sort of weathering as an activity that in terms of listening. And that's sort of also in terms of Janet's work and the role of the imaginary. And I know Janet is in the process right now of conducting a lot of interviews. And so that kind of what is that kind of listening activity as well that is very, is a centering practice in Janet's work as well. And so, at the point she is right now, what is that listening activity bringing up? I had a chance to sort of read sort of Megan's submission that she's given, and I thought it was quite interesting that some of the theory that she uses is a little bit different from the way that she speaks about her work when she's speaking about artistic practice. So the language can be sort of very alienating and male-centric in a way, sort of speaks in terms of sort of patriarchal language in the ways that she speaks, separation, dominant, non-human. And then when she speaks in terms of artistic practice, it is incredibly different. It's very feminist. It's warm. It's comforting in the way she speaks about water, and so there's very different fields between the 2 of them. And I also just wanted to sort of also mention that she speaks about Barrett in terms of. There's a thing about, however, it is unclear to what extent artists in the global south directly engage with the agents of separability, which allow for a thicker understanding into how one part of the universe makes itself intelligible to another part. And I wasn't quite sure what that actually meant, especially because, in so much of the global south in terms of, water spirits, in terms of marble water. We are speaking about legacies of artistic practice, creative practice, thinking through with water spirits. And, with Roelof, I was just interested, and I'll pick up the discussion a little bit later about what it means to produce productively as he speaks, and some of the ways in which he's unpacking transfiguration. But I'll return to that a bit later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Charlene, and thanks especially for pointing out how we've got these fields of discourse about the practices and then the practices themselves with their very own agency, I think, in these presentations. So David, I'd love to offer you a response next, please.
Thanks, Brett. And thanks to Christo and Zanele for inviting me. Thanks to the other panelists as well, and especially thanks to the presenters. I think that there are some particular comments that I will make about individual presentations, and I'll do that very, very briefly. Some of them, perhaps not all of them, but I think that what I'd like to do is to try and pose some questions, broader questions, for consideration by the presenters in terms of their work, but for the gathering as a whole today. I think that one of the things that strikes me about the 4 presentations is this incredible sense of rigor that works across each of these projects. And I think that, it's a pity that we weren't able to see more of Janet's film. But as a supervisor, someone that's been working with PhD students in this area, with an interest in artistic research, I'm really interested in how the creative practice drives this research. And I think it's one of the things that is present in each of the presentations. And I think that Megan, Roelof, Brigitte, and Janet have done remarkably well in the short time that they've been afforded to give us a sense of that rigor. But I want to mark that, how the creative practice drives the research. And I suppose the question that I'd like to ask them is to think about what this rigor looks like. What does it feel like in terms of the artistic research that we are doing? And here I always go back to a curriculum theorist's thinking around curriculum, and describes curriculum as something that is about relations, recursion, richness, and rigor. I'm not going to go into that, but his notion of rigor is one which suggests that it's a different logic to one that is often held in the academic world. I'd be interested for the presenters and all of us to consider what this rigor is, and how artistic research drives it. I work closely with Megan and with Brigitte on their processes. I've had some insight into Roelof and Janet's. And there are many, I think it was you, Brett, that suggested that there are many convergences. I think Charlene has indicated that as well. I think it's remarkable, the convergences across these 4 presentations. And there's something exhilarating about that as someone observing PhD in creative work at the Wits School of Arts. And on that level, just like to congratulate all the 4 presenters. Just one last, if I've got time, just a few more particular comments. I mean, for Brigitte, I think that one of the things that has happened in the process of showing the work, and I'm specifically not calling it an exhibition, but it's a bringing together of the material, this material that has this incredible agency. And I think that being in that space with the material, albeit a museum space, I think has afforded really interesting kind of meta layers for the research. One being, which I know that Brigitte will look at in the written component, is around how her research starts to speak to a revisiting and a rethinking of how we approach arriving at solutions for spatial problems. I think she, coming from an architecture background, she often speaks about how very often the thinking is, well, we'll put a building there. And I think that what her research shows or starts to point towards is something very different. I think I'm going to stop there. I could say more particular things about the other three, but let me stop there. Perhaps we can pick it up in the last session this afternoon.
Thanks very much, David. Really value that. So Alex, we're going to go to you next. And Christo and Zanella have indicated to me that we can stretch until 10:50 if other colleagues want to place other questions in the chat. But let's give Alex his allotted 5 minutes. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. I already had kind of 2 minutes, so I will try to be short in order to leave more space for others. I'm really impressed, and I'm really delighted by the presentations. And one point that is for me very relevant is that all of you stress the question of the practices. Yeah, I think I think it would be interesting to be even more radical and going beyond the idea of practice-based, but talking about so research through practices, yeah, which is a kind of reinforcing the idea that as any other kind of research, we research through our own practices, through our aesthetic or artistic practices. Yeah, mathematicians research through mathematical practices. So this is nothing that we are inventing, but we are specifying in another way. So in this sense, it was very nice that all the presentations, and I guess also Janet, we can also find this in the link you sent above. To send it in the chat, that you deliver a kind of catalog of your practices. Yeah, this is extremely important, extremely relevant for the field. Yeah, so that when we really talk about methodology, we really do. Yeah, and that we really show how do we do it, because as Janet said, it is about the how. Yeah, in always, but I think in case of artistic research, most definitely. In this sense, I'm very thankful for you, David, that you talk about the question of rigor, because I think the question of rigor is extremely linked to the question of the practices. So there are these, I think you all show rigorous practices of research. And I think this is the most promising and solid basis for any PhD process. Just because you, Krista, mentioned my critical position towards production of knowledge in artistic research, I want to say it that I don't negate this possibility. What I'm in favor of is to positioning artistic research in a specific situation in an ecology of knowledge production. I think that the four works, the four processes or projects that were shown today make clear that artistic research provide conditions for knowledge generation. Yeah, but I think that interestingly, there should be other forms of research that close what we open. Yeah. So I think the same way that I come back again to the mathematicians provide a fantastic base for engineers to develop their own practices and to close into a functional object or functional tool what they enable. I think artist researchers disclose new intelligibilities on the topics we research, and then provide radically new conditions for the production of knowledge. Yeah. These sets, a few comments on Megan, Rolf, and Janet, because I talked briefly already about digital, so I'm sorry to briefly, but this is the time constraint. Megan, I was really impressed by the poetic of your writing. And I think this is what Charlene, and I see you agreeing already, was mentioning with this clearly feminine agency of your work. So I really think that this should be reinforced, that there's a gold mine in the way you write and in the way you speak out your writing. Definitely. I would really reinforce that. So in terms of the work of Rolf, I was really struck by your beautiful focus on these absences, what you call the cleavings in the archives, and how did you transform this idea in a practice? You know, so opening new clearings which bring to expression these absences. I think this was a fantastic poetic turn, kind of in the basis of your whole methodology. And I think also the idea of picturing, this make also clear the idea of, the diversity that the concept of picturing inhabits. Yeah? So in terms of generating pictures, but framing the generation of further pictures. Yeah? So this dialogue between absence and presence is really fantastically unfold in your work. I was muted the whole time? No, I'm sorry. I just got a message, so I was terrified. Sorry.
No, you're not unmuted. Sorry, if I can just come in. There's some background noise coming.
Yeah. I'm in a co-working space. I'm sorry.
Okay,
That's but I can take my microphone closer to my mouth. I hope it's better now. So, and now to finish, come to Janet. I mean, and also like these all these references to question the foundations, the classical foundations of what documentary film is, right? Which is actually question the relationship between documentary practices and the idea of reality, of a given reality, or a given knowledge on this reality. So I think definitely this is the strength of documentary film as artistic research discipline, we could say. And I was also thinking about, and this is also like the idea of a little bit questioning this individuality of each PhD process, how amazing it would be if you and Megan kind of create a connection, you know, in order to together disclose this given reality, what the ocean is. You know, I think both works open perspective. It would be really amazing if these two works could be connected. Yeah, I think I will end up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that appreciation, Alex. So I'd also like to thank our colleague Fuad for his very thoughtful and extensive question in the chat. He's indicated he needs to step out. So rather than maybe lose him now, maybe he'll be able to rejoin us this afternoon. But I think it's a good comment picking up on David's remark about what rigor really means in creative and practice-led research processes and its affordances. So colleagues, I really think there's enormous strength in placing these practices at the center of the conversation. And let's leave them there and ruminate on them. And of course, we have the treat of 2 subsequent sessions. And by the time we really can reflect by the last session today, we will have this range of practices in our ears and in our eyes and in our minds. So huge thanks again to the presenters. Thanks to my fellow panelists. We'll take a break now, and we will resume at 11. Thank you so much. Take care.